Good evening to everyone. I am Claudette Snorton, and I am the co-director of the Nehemiah Project, and I'm also the pastor of Lampkins Chapel, Christian Methodist Episcopal Church in Louisville, Kentucky. I have the distinct honor in presenting our Edwards Lecture Series speaker for tonight, Bishop Othal Hawthorne Lakey. Bishop Lakey is the 44th Bishop of the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. He was elected on May 9th, 1982. From 1974 to 1982, Bishop Lakey was the editor of the Christian Index, which is the official publication of the CME Church. From 1982 to 1994, Bishop Lakey was the presiding bishop of the Second Episcopal District, which happens to be my district. The General Conference in 1994 assigned him to the Sixth Episcopal District. At the 2010 General Conference, Bishop Lakey was honorably retired. Bishop Lakey served as the chair of the Department of Christian Education in the CME Church, the chair of the Commission on History and Archives, and as a member of the board of directors of the National Congress of Black Churches. Bishop Lakey was a regular panelist on the nationally syndicated television program, The American Religious Town Hall. Bishop Lakey is the author of The Rise of Colored Methodism, a study of the background and beginnings of the CME Church, the history of the CME Church, and God in My Mama's House, the women's movement in the CME Church. Amen. Bishop Lakey is a warm and inviting gentleman, having a wealth of knowledge about the CME Church. Most of all, Bishop Lakey is a mighty man of God, possessing a love for preaching and teaching. It is my pleasure to present the 44th Bishop of the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, Bishop Othal Hawthorne Lakey.
Thank you so very, very much, Reverend Claudette Snorton. It's hard to believe that I was your bishop when you were a very young lady, almost a girl. So that carries me way, way back with pleasant memories. So too, Reverend Snorton, and may I take the privilege of recognizing my colleague, Bishop Marvin Frank Thomas, and all the members of the CME Church who may be tuned in, and to the president and the leadership of the Louisville Presbyterian Seminary. Many years ago, I was on the campus 2 or 3 times. On one memorable occasion on the Louisville Presbyterian campus was when the American Historical Society met there, and I was privileged to be one of the speakers at that occasion. So I'm just delighted to share in this Edwards Peacemaking Lecture Series, and especially the Nehemiah Project. But having said that, I'm so delighted that there's a growing awareness and I think importance of the Black church in our world today, and this is good. But this is a lecture on history, and I need to warn you now that history is a dull project. It's a boring subject. If you want to go to sleep, get you a thick history book and start reading, and your insomnia will go away, and you will go to sleep because history is dull. And yet, it is, I think, one of the most important subjects we can ever study, especially for religion and especially for the church. I think it was John Meacham who said that history is the present in conversation with the past in preparation for the future. So as I say, though it may be dull and monotonous and routine, the history is vitally important. If you forget your history, you will forget who you are. When I was pastoring my first church, Claudette, up in Pasco, Washington, I had a good relationship with the priest of the Episcopal Church, Reverend Andrew Daughters. We struck up a friendship, and for the first time in the history of those communities, a black church and a white church interchanged services, which was odd back at that time, a CME church and an Episcopal church together. Well, one summer, Reverend Andrews, my friend, he went up to check out the summer camp that the Episcopal church had for its young people, and he never returned. He never came back. And they searched for him high and low. They could never find him. So they declared him dead. But a year or so later, a person wandered into an Episcopal church in San Francisco and said, "I think I belong here." And this priest had heard of that incident and realized it was Reverend Daughters. Up in that mountain, he had gotten amnesia, had forgotten everything, lost completely his memory. He didn't know who he was. Didn't know what his family was. Didn't know what his ministry was because he'd forgotten his history. And what happened to Reverend Andrew Daughters can happen to churches, to institutions. We can have institutional amnesia. We can forget where we came from. We forget who we are. We forget what made us what we are. And therefore, history is important that we not forget. For remember when Joshua crossed the Jordan River on dry land, he told the priests to put up some stones, and said the reason for these stones is that when your children ask you what these stones mean, you can tell them that Israel crossed over the Jordan on dry land. We need to always remember so we can tell our children our story. So though, as I say, history is dull and dry and monotonous, it is ultimately really important for the history of the church. I also might remark that having church, that most of us like to do it, and being in church is totally different from studying the history of the church. For if you don't know the history of your church, you don't know why you're having the church the way you have it, and you don't realize what being in church really means. So history is vitally important. But for the task before me this evening, on the 50th anniversary of the CME Church in 1920, Bishop Randall Albert Carter said this. He said, "A little more than 50 years ago, a little company of men of heroic mold met in Jackson, Tennessee, one December day to organize a new church. They wanted to try the experiment of making a church of colored people who, though but yesterday slaves, would work and live in the territory which was then owned and controlled by their masters." In that little band of pioneers, he said, were men destined to leave their impress indelibly upon the thought of coming. Now, that little company of men of heroic mold that Bishop Carter referred to he referred to 41 ex-slaves, and they were in an official general conference authorized by the Methodist Episcopal Church South. That conference convened on December 16th, 1870, at the First Methodist Episcopal Church South in Jackson, Tennessee, on a resolution from the Keys Tabernacle Church in Mount Sterling, Kentucky, incidentally. The name chosen for that new church was the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church in America. The Colored Methodist Episcopal Church in America. This, as I suggest, it is the title of the presentation I want to make in the next few minutes. This was the rise of colored Methodism. The rise of colored Methodism. But here in the 21st century, I need not remind you that the term colored, with reference to African Americans, is totally antiquated, and to some has become somewhat pejorative. As a young black news person told me many years ago when I was promoting my book, The Rise of Colored Methodism, he said, Reverend, I don't think I can have that interview because we're not colored anymore. And I suspect that's the attitude of life. We're not colored anymore. But if we transport ourselves back in time for just a moment, take a time warp and go back 150 years or so, we will come to understand that from about 1830 to about 1930, the preferred term, the most widely used, and indeed the most popular self-designation for Black people was colored. Now let me repeat that, lest I lost someone in the translation. What I'm saying is that from 1830 to 1930, African Americans had chosen for their name the term colored. In 1831, for example, there was a national conference of free people of color that met in Philadelphia. Or in 1851, there was the normal school for colored girls was established in Washington, D.C. Now, it is no longer the normal school for colored girls. It is now the University of the District of Columbia. But the University of the District of Columbia was the normal school for colored girls in 1851. Or there was the national, the Colored National Labor Union was established in 1869. And in May 1874, that was the Colored Cumberland Presbyterian Church. Yes, the Colored Cumberland Presbyterian Church was organized in Nashville, Tennessee in 1874. and a John F. Humphrey was the first stated clerk of its General Assembly. And then I need not mention the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So though it is now passé and antiquated, and sometimes, as I say, pejorative, the term colored for Black Americans had as a noble heritage and a noble history. So when those 41 black men, only 5 years removed from slavery, when they chose the name Colored for their new church, they were in keeping with what Black people all over the nation considered themselves to be. They were colored people. Colored captured the ethos of who they were, what they were, and whose they were. To phrase it in the popular vernacular of our day, colored meant our lives matter. And if they don't matter to any other, if our lives don't matter to anybody else, they matter to us. And they matter to the God who created us in God's own image and in God's own likeness. And so I'm talking tonight about the rise of colored Methodism. Now, though we can understand why those 41 ex-slaves chose the name colored for their new church, the overriding question is why were they organizing a church in the first place, albeit a colored one? Why, in other words, why the rise of colored Methodism? This leads us to ask, who were those 41 men? What prompted them to gather that December day in Jackson, Tennessee? Why? Now, of course, the answer begins with the fact that during their slavery, they had been members of the Methodist Episcopal Church South. As is well known, and if it's not, we should point it out, slavery began in America in 1619. And Methodism came to America in 1761. And Methodism was officially organized in America in 1784 as the Methodist Episcopal Church. John Wesley and the early Methodists were unalterably opposed to slavery. In fact, the only occasion that I've found when any person could be excommunicated from the communion table in Methodism, the only time I could find out when you couldn't take communion in Methodism was for owning slaves. The early Methodists, you could not own slaves. However, I'm sad to say, as Methodism rapidly expanded geographically and numerically, more and more slave owners and slaves joined the Methodist Church. So sadly, as I say, Methodism, as Christian churches have done throughout the centuries, Methodism adjusted its doctrine to accommodate the exigencies of the time. So by 1824, the Methodist Episcopal Church adopted the policy that said it was all right, it was Christian to own slaves as long as you treated them right. We changed the doctrine to meet the changing times. Adjacent to the Seelbach Hotel in downtown Louisville, there is an historical marker. And that marker is the site of the 4th Street Methodist Church, where the Methodist Episcopal Church South was organized in 1845. Now, I say the Methodist Episcopal Church South was organized in 1845 in Louisville, Kentucky. Now, needless to say, as slavery had become the dominant political issue of the nation, as more and more slave owners and slaves joined the Methodist Church, it became the most divisive issue within the church. So in 1844, meeting in New York, the Methodist Episcopal Church legally and formally split. It split over the issue of slavery. So hence that marker in downtown Louisville, Kentucky, marking the organization of the Methodist Episcopal Church South. Now, upon its organization, the CME Church South, it set up a vigorous mission to the slaves. I wish I had time to go in some of the reasoning why they set up this vigorous mission to evangelize the slaves. They didn't set up a program to eradicate in slavery. No, they set up a program to Christianize, to make Christians out of the slaves while they were still slaves. You can understand the tremendous theological and moral issues that such a issue raises. But the operative belief was that you could save the soul. You could save the souls of slaves, even as you held his body in abject slavery. That was the theological position. So the evangelistic efforts of the CME Church South were really phenomenal. And it was the most successful, or they were more successful than any other Protestant body. In 1860, the annual conferences of the Methodist Episcopal Church South reported a total of 207,766 slave members of the church. Now, when seen in its proper perspective, that number is astonishing. For example, the total members, the total white membership of the CME Church South was 533,000. This meant that there were 39% as many slave members as white members in the Methodist Episcopal Church South. Or again, of the whole picture, approximately 447,000 total slave members were members of Protestant churches. So very few churches other than the Quakers escaped the taint of slavery. So all of the Protestant churches combined had a total of 447,000 slave members in Protestant churches. And of these 447,000, 45% were members of the CME Church South. Our Baptist brothers and sisters don't like to hear this, but there were more slave Methodists than there were slave Baptists. So, Claudette, you can tell your Baptist friends that if you are so inclined. But as we consider the reported members of Christian churches during slavery, there is a misperception we need to correct. You see, in our zeal to stress the importance of the religion of the Black experience, we tend to romanticize that religion so much so that we get the feeling that all of the slaves were slipping into the praise houses or the hush arbors. All of them were slipping in there to sing "Steal Away to Jesus." I'm saying we get the impression that Black religion covered everybody, and all the slaves did while they was just sing and dance and have religion and have church. No, that wasn't quite the way it was. Actually, there were only about 10% of the slaves who were members of all the churches. But that corresponded with the membership in the churches across the nation. Don't believe that lie that America is a Christian nation. No, in most of its history, less than 10% of Americans were members of churches. And my love for my brethren and sisters of the faith will not allow me to suggest that there may be some questions about whether calling yourself Christian renders you truly Christian in the eyes of Jesus Christ. If you look at the way so many Christians treat so many other Christians who share the faith. I wouldn't judge anybody, but it's hard for me to believe that you really love the Lord in Jesus Christ and can do some of the things we do in the name of Jesus Christ. But that's a sermon for another church, so I'll go on with my lecture. My whole point here is simply to say that we got to be careful of assuming that the Black church was universal, that everybody belonged to the church. Everybody was going to prayer meeting and everybody was going to church. No, that was not the case. And we need to understand that. So I don't get too upset when we bemoan the fact that so many people are leaving the church and the church is becoming unpopular. That doesn't upset me. I'm concerned, but it doesn't upset me because the Christian faith in its essence has always been a minority. And I dare tell you that when you preach the gospel, the way the gospel is supposed to be preached, and stay away from the popularities and those things that draw people just for drawing's sake, as Jesus said, broad is the road that leads to destruction, and it's filled, but narrow is the path that leads to life, and only now and then a traveler. But as I say, that's a sermon for another church. I'm merely saying, be careful that when we confuse multiplicity with significance, be careful when we confuse numbers with quality. Be careful. 5,000 were on the mountain to be fed by Jesus. Only 4 or 5 women were at the cross when he was crucified. So the Methodist Episcopal Church South had 207,000 members at the beginning of the Civil War. But on January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation declared all slaves free. However, the hostilities of the war did not end until General Lee surrendered on April 9, 1865. But slaves in northern Louisiana, where I was born, and Texas were not set free until June 19th. Now, a whole lot has been written about communications and all that. That's not true. The truth of the matter is they wanted to hold the slaves until the crops were planted in the spring. And then on June 19th, they declared them free. So when I was a little boy growing up in northern Louisiana, we didn't know anything about July 4th, but we had a big time on Juneteenth. We had red strawberry drinks, watermelon, ice cream. We had a big time, and everybody was off from work on Juneteenth. That's when we were set free. But the question before me now is, what was the impact of freedom on the religion of those who were, as Albert Carter said, but yesterday slaves? So what was the impact of freedom on the religion that the slaves had espoused when they were slaves? What was the impact on their Christian faith? Well, in his seminal work, An American Dilemma, Gunnar Myrdal says this: this period witnessed another wave of conversion to Christianity of the Negroes and the firm establishment of independent Negro churches. The impact of freedom on the religion of the slaves was the establishment in the South of independent Negro churches. independent of the white denomination. This means that though the former slaves withdrew from the churches of the masters, they did not withdraw from the religion of the masters. You see, they had embraced the religion, but when time came, they withdrew from the churches. So as a result of the devastation, the upheaval, and the dislocation of the Civil War, of that 207,000 members of the Methodist Episcopal Church South, only 78,000 remained in 1866. So from 207,000 to 78,000 meant that 2/3 of the members left or could not be found in the Methodist Episcopal Church South. While many ask, where did those 2/3 go? My question is, why did that 1/3 stay? I mean, why? If you could just leave the church of your masters, why not just leave? That's my question, and I have an answer. Isaac Lane of Tennessee, he was one of those 41 men, and some 12 years later would be the founder of Lane College. Isaac Lane said, we wanted a church patterned after our own ideas and notions. That's what Isaac Lane said. And Lucius H. Hulsey of Georgia, also one of the 41, and some 12 years later would be the founder of Payne College. He sent a formal petition to the General Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church South, in which he expressed, these were his words, a separate ecclesiastical jurisdiction with their own ordained preachers and bishops. So our Black members of the church, one of which was W.P. Churchill, who was presiding elder of the Louisville district there in Kentucky, expressed this sentiment that they wanted their own church. So central to this desire for their own church was the expressed conviction, however. They wanted their own church, but the conviction was that the white church, the mother church, if you please, owed them a church of their own. Now let me repeat that for now. What I'm saying is that Lane and Hulsey and Churchill and B.S. Newton and Marshall, those early persons in that 41, they felt not only that they wanted their own church, but those preachers and missionaries who had preached the gospel to them, who had converted them, who had let them preach, they owed them their own church. It was their obligation. They made a claim on the white church. You owe us a church. Now that's what they said. But now, why would they want that when they had some alternatives? See, they didn't just have. their feeling helps explain, that feeling, however, helps explain why they didn't go to the other alternatives. What were these alternatives? Well, you see, already existing was the African Methodist Episcopal Church, started by Richard Allen, which was formally organized in 1816. And then there was the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Zion, that was organized by up in the state of New York, up in New York City. In fact, it was organized, I understand, formally in 1824. Well, after the Civil War was over, they sent preachers and missionaries to the South saying, we seek our brethren. We come to find our brethren. And then in addition, the Methodist Episcopal Church, the white church in the North, they sent missionaries and preachers to the South to convert or win over to their church that they were establishing to be members of the Methodist Episcopal Church from the North. And not only that, but being a white church, they were in good relationship with the Freedmen's Bureau. So they could offer the freed slaves some enticements that even the other black denominations could not offer. So these were the alternatives that the early colored members had. So then they said, no, we want our own church. And they petitioned the church. Well, how did the Church South, how did the white folk, how do they respond to these demands, these requests, these insistence that y'all give us our own church? Well, when the conference met in 1866, the White Conference met in New Orleans, and incidentally, that was the first time that the Methodist Church South had met since 1858, because the Civil War prevented the 1862 meeting. And they had a lot of problems, as you can well understand. Their churches had been devastated. Their lands had been wiped out virtually. But in the midst of all of their internal other problems, the prominent question was, and this was in their minutes, they had a special committee. What shall be done to promote the religious interests of our colored members? And they gave an answer to that question. The CME Church South authorized their bishops to organize colored quarterly conferences, colored annual conferences, ordain colored preachers as elders and deacons. And most significantly, it authorized that when 2 or more annual conferences had been organized, they were to set them apart into a separate ecclesiastical jurisdiction. The General Conference of 1866 authorized the bishops of the church to set up the colored members into their own ecclesiastical jurisdiction. So in accord with that authorization, between 1866 and 1870, the bishops did it. So when the General Conference met in 1870 in Memphis, Tennessee, the bishops reported that five annual conferences, colored annual conferences, had been organized, and 45 presiding elders districts had been set up. And most significantly, this is what they said in their report. It is our purpose to call a general conference to be held next winter for the purpose of organizing them into an entirely separate church, and thus enable them to be their own guides and governors. They authorized the establishment of a new church. But then the General Conference unanimously approved the report of the bishops and added something totally unprecedented. It approved this resolution that all trustees now holding church property for the use of our colored membership be instructed to make titles to said property to the properly constituted trustees of the Colored CME Church South according to the discipline of said church when organized. Do you know what that means? It meant that thousands of pieces of church property, millions of dollars of church property, valued property, was to be deeded to the colored church when that church was organized. I can't find anywhere in church history where a church gave that kind of property to its membership. It was unprecedented. So when the CME Church was organized, it didn't have to go out and build churches. It had churches already built. So then, that was the authority and the prospect and the enthusiasm and the expectation of those 41 men who gathered in Jackson, Tennessee on December 16th, 1870. Now, I've mentioned the name, the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church in America. What I didn't emphasize was that though it was a colored church, the white church expected it to be the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church South. But no, that committee that made the recommendation on a resolution from Keys Tabernacle in Mount Sterling, Kentucky, they said, no, it's to be the Methodist, Colored Methodist Episcopal Church in America. The early CMEs wanted it to be known. Yes, they were colored. Yes, they were Methodists. But yes, they were American. The Methodist, the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church in America. But after choosing their name, the 41 delegates had to address the question of their, of their polity. That is the question of their structure, the question of the rules and regulations by which the church would be governed and under which it would operate. They were establishing an institution. And one of the first institutions of the post-Civil War South, one of the first institutions created by Black folk in post-Civil War South was the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church in America. So when I talk about the rise of colored Methodism, I'm talking about one of the first organized bodies. You see, this institution, they were established in post-Civil War South. It was a church created by Blacks or by Black people, for Black people, under the complete authority of Black people. This is going to be our church. Ours. We run it. Nobody else but us. Now let me let me digress. I must digress for just a moment, and maybe suggest what one of my problems, one of my pet peeves I have with some popular histories of the Black church. And that problem, that pet peeve, is the neglect or the omission of the church as an institution. You see, the temptation is to take anecdotes and excerpts of Black religious worship and hold that up, or those up, as the Black church. See, you see, the temptation is to go get a choir gyrating, drums beating, and organs in choreographed rhythm. And we show that. This is the religion of Black folk. And of course we do that. Oh yes, we shout, we jump, we do all of it. But those are expressions of our worship, and that come out of our institution. And you don't understand why we doing that which we do unless you understand the institution out of which it comes. Institutions outline authority. Institutions define responsibilities. Institutions set up structures of accountability and set forth the mission. Institutions determine the moral conduct of its members, its leaders, and hold them accountable. The church as an institution must develop ways to teach the faith to its children. The church as an institution has to determine how it will transmit its heritage to generations following. You cannot understand the Black church, and the Black church will cease to exist unless you understand and study the institutions that make up the Black church. So to put into more effective structure on an institution they were organizing, those leaders, they adopted the discipline of the Methodist Episcopal Church South. When you read the minutes, they went through that discipline line by line. They took out what didn't apply to them and set up a church of their own. And let me see one more little thing, sort of a digress. That is, it's amazing how doctrinally sound our Black denominations are. You find very, very little deviation from basic Christian theology, from basic Christian doctrine, from basic Christian beliefs within the Black church. Then finally, what they did was to those early, those 41, they elected leaders. They elected William Henry Miles of Kentucky as their first bishop, Richard H. Vanderhorst of Georgia as their second bishop. They elected Isaac H. Anderson, a well-to-do former slave, as the book agent. They elected a young man named Little John Scurlock as editor of the Christian Index. He resigned a few months later to run for the state legislature in Mississippi, and he was lynched by the Ku Klux Klan. They elected good leaders. Well, the poet, I believe it was James Russell Lowell, said, "New occasions teach new duties. Time makes ancient good uncouth." Though colored had served the race and the church for generations. As the nation entered the 1930s, the new designation Negro began to take its place. At the same time as the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church expanded beyond the South, the place of its birth, the place of its heritage, and moved into the North, the Midwest, and the West Coast, from sea to shining sea. The term colored was becoming the symbol of unabashed bigotry, a visible sign of overt and legal racism. Colored came to mean colored only, outright oppression, and downright repression. So on May 14th, 1954, led by Channing H. Tobias, who had served as chair of the board of the national of the NAACP, the church changed the name from colored to the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. I need to remind you that was not a unanimous vote. It was a vigorous debate, and many CMEs fought it. They did not want to change the name, take colored out of the name. And some wonder, why did we choose Christian? Well, as I looked at it and studied and talked to some of those who were there at the time, they said that though we were Methodists and we were colored, we were above all Christian. And one of the songs we loved to sing was, "Lord, I want to be a Christian in my heart." And so they took out the name colored and put in the name Christian, for in their hearts, they were always Christian. And so, as I close, though the name was rightly changed to meet the challenges of changing times, in our sacred memory, it remains a lasting monument of a faith that did not shrink, though pressed by every foe. It remains a testimony to a hope that continued to live, even when dashed on the rocks of despair. It remains a witness to that love eternal that flooded souls and still flows from heart to heart and breast to breast. Yes, my brothers and sisters, because of the rise of colored Methodism, we proclaim of the Church of Jesus Christ. For her, our tears shall fall. For her, our prayers ascend. To her, our cares and toils be given, till toils and cares shall end. Thank you for being so kind and so patient.
Thank you, Bishop Lakey. For anyone who has questions, feel free to use the raise hand function at the bottom of the screen or the Q&A function, or you may type your question in the chat box. And with that, I believe we have a question from Reverend Ernie Williams. How did we go from colored to Negro to Black to African American? Who gave us the term African American?
That was a time when we were coming out of the civil rights movement, moving out of the 60s into the 70s. And the term Negro had become almost the way I described the way the term colored had gone. And we were looking for a different way to express the needs of the time. And the African heritage had sort of gotten lost in our development. And so many Black people began to believe that we need to tie our heritage as descendants of Africa to who we were as Americans. So we tried one time the Afro-American, and that didn't seem to catch on. And so slowly, African American began to catch on, and it began to stick. But the import of the question is that all of these terms by which we call ourselves have not been given to us by some outside group. They evolved out of our collective experiences together. And so we sort of mutually began to agree and use the term. That's the best I can do on that one.
All righty, thank you. From Gerald Taylor, he asks, what are the challenges facing the church today?
In my judgment, the challenge before the church, and I mean the Black church, the African American church, is to be the church of Jesus Christ. And I believe that because of our unique heritage, the Black church is uniquely poised to speak truth to power in this present age. The truth, as we in our faith believes, comes out of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And in light of that gospel, we need to speak to people, to the hallways of power, to Congress, to the president, to the Supreme Court, to corporate America, to our educational institutions, and speak the truth about what it means to be a human being created in the image and likeness of God. We need to proclaim love, but we need to define the love we proclaim. I think it was Reinhold Niebuhr who said that love on a social level is justice. And so the challenge before the church, as I see it, the Black church, is to constantly proclaim the call for justice and righteousness and goodness. And only in this way can we break the hold of institutionalized, structured, systemic racism, not only against Black America, but against all peoples.
Excellent. Another question from Reginald Barnes. Speak on the CME Church's commitment to higher education.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barnes. I had that in my notes, but my time was running out on me. We at one time had we sponsored more than 21 schools. The Black high school in Hartwell, Georgia, for example, until the integration, came out of the Flat Rock CME Church. The Jackson High School in Dublin, Georgia, came out of the CME Harriet Hosley School there in Dublin. There's a little church in Simsboro, Louisiana, where the church on Sunday was church. On Monday, it became the elementary school. Today, we have 4 liberal arts colleges, Payne College in Augusta, Georgia, Lane College in Jackson, Tennessee, Miles College in Birmingham, Alabama, Texas College, and I happen to be using their Founders Day emblem at Texas College in Tyler, Texas. And then we have a theological school, the Phillips School of Theology, which I think Dr. Barnes is a graduate in a member, a consortia member of the Interdenominational Theological Center. So we've been involved in higher education, education from our very, very founding.
All right, a question from Chinita Thompson. Were there any other reasons why the Methodists did not join the already established denomination other than wanting their own church?
Yes, there were. We don't say this too much publicly, but the relationships between the Black denominations has not always been smooth. There was a lot of suspicion that the churches from the North, the Black churches, were a little bit condescending to those who were freed by the Civil War. They wanted them in their churches, but the feeling was that they would only be members. They could have a difficult time moving to higher leadership. There were some disputes over the property issues, and there were some concerns about what in the arguments back in the 1880s and all about the legitimacy of Episcopal leadership in some of those churches. So there were some interdenominational disputes that were going on at the time. And the other part was the highly politicalization of Black churches by the, what they call them, scalawags and carpetbaggers. And Black churches were used in that radical Reconstruction period. So there were some factors there that accounted for it also.
Excellent. And from Frederick Braddock Sr., when did the CME Church move from a Southern institution to a national and international institution?
Thank you for that question. It began really in the early 1900s, around when Charles Henry Phillips was elected bishop in 1902. He was assigned to the West Coast, and he began to have ventures in the West Coast into the Southwest. And as CMEs, colored members of the CME Church moved into Cleveland and New York and Detroit, they would ask for bishops to come and establish churches. So it began with the migration of Black folk out of the South into the North, Midwest, and into the West.
All right, and from Regina Reese Young, because of the constant blending of cultures, do you think that the Black church will continue to be the Black church in the future? And she has Black in quotation marks.
Yes, Black will stay in quotation marks, Regina. The difficulty with in eradicating racism is that because of the color of our skin, Black folk are going to have a hard time being assimilated into the larger culture. Plus, we don't want to be white. We want to be who we are. So I don't think that our culture is going to be eradicated or fade away anytime soon. I think if we keep what I mentioned earlier, the memory of our institutional life together, I think we will last for a long time. And I, for one, would hate for us to give up our culture, because there's a lot in the Black experience that I think white America needs. And we need to keep who we are alive and share it with others. So I don't think we're going to be fading away anytime soon.
All right, a question from L. Germain Woods. discuss the challenges that exist within Christian Methodism as it relates to patriarchy, both historically and now.
I'm working on a book. I probably won't ever get it finished. It's called The Role of Femininity in the Unfolding Drama of the Bible, in which I take on this whole issue of patriarchy and misogyny within the biblical tradition and within the Christian faith. And patriarchy is very difficult to overcome. One of the challenges is that many of our female preachers, rather than bringing to bear their perspectives, they too easily acquiesce to patriarchal thinking. I smile when some of our women preachers, when they get up to read the scriptures, will refrain or not use translations that have inclusive language. A few years ago, we had a proposal to upgrade the language of our articles of religion to take out the patriarchal language. And many of the women voted that down. So part of our challenge in overcoming patriarchy is having our female members always keep it before us and not embrace it themselves.
All righty. From Jermaine Marshall, how would you address the characterization of the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church as the, in quotes, old slavery church due to what has been identified as paternalistic relationship between the MECS and the CME churches?
Well, the accusation was, as Jermaine probably knows better than I, the accusation following our organization was that we were the old slavery church. But Lucius Holsey and that crowd said, now look, this nation is going to be run by white folk. Are we going to deal with the white folk from the north that we do not know? Or are we going to deal with the white folk in the south whom we know? And they had no illusion. And they found out in the Tillman Compromise that the southern whites would easily sell out for their own advantage. And so I denied that we were a slavery church. All Black churches were made up of those who had been slaves. Even Richard Allen had been a slave. So when we talk about the old slavery church, what church are we talking about? Are we talking about a church that went and got what it demanded from the white established church? So I argue that there was no such thing as an old slavery church, because all of our churches were composed of former slaves. But we're free. We're free. Thank God Almighty, we're free at last.
All right. From Gene Hawkshurst, how does the CME Church feel about the possible split in the United Methodist Church, and might it affect the relationship between the two churches?
It won't affect the relationship between the churches, but we're all in prayer for our brethren and sisters in the United Methodist Church, because this issue is so volatile and fraught with so many traditions and cultures and biblical interpretations. I wrote my last book published. It's called Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered, a study of homosexuality in the African American church. And when my book came out, we had some rip-roaring discussions about it, because I came to a conclusion that we as Christian churches have not sat down and openly, honestly considered the whole issue of the LGBTQ community. And so I don't know how our brothers and sisters in the United Methodist Church will come out on this one. They had, when the issue of slavery was up, as I mentioned, in 1844, they couldn't handle it as one church. They had to split. They were able to come back in the 1930s, and then again with others in, I think, in 1968. I don't know how they're going to handle this one, but my prayers are for them.
All right, a question from Marcy Weissner. What is the relationship with the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, with what I have seen used?
Our relationship now, of course, is very, very cordial. We, down through the years, have had many discussions about possible organic union. We are always together in all sorts of ways. So the relationships are very, very cordial. But we are finding out that over the centuries now, each of us has developed our own cultural traditions, and it's very, very difficult to merge these cultural traditions. But our brotherhood and sisterhood is strong, and we work together very, very well.
All right, from Jeanette Bonight. What has the involvement been of the CME Church in the civil rights movement? Does the CME Church continue to speak out regarding social justice issues and voters' rights?
I wish I had another hour on that one, Jeanette. We have been at the forefront of every movement towards civil rights. Martin Luther King spoke to our 1958 General Conference, met in Detroit, Michigan, and praised the CME Church for the support it had. It was my privilege back in 1962. I was pastoring in Portland, Oregon, and secretary of the Education Committee of the Urban League. And we invited Martin Luther King to come to speak to the Portland community. He did a tremendous job at the Civic Auditorium. And myself and Dr. O.B. Williams of the Vancouver Avenue Baptist Church and our wives, we drove Martin Luther King to the airport, one of the thrilling moments of my life. We've been at the forefront at everything. In his last march in Memphis, our Bishop B. Junior Smith is arm in arm with him. Donald L. Hollowell was the attorney for Martin Luther King here in Georgia. He was the one who helped integrate the University of Georgia. J.W. Bonner was treasurer of the Montgomery Improvement Association when he was pastoring our first church. Jesse Douglas was a leader there. And all up and down in every hamlet, our church has been at the forefront of leadership in the civil rights movement. I mentioned Channing H. Tobias, chair of the board of the NAACP. Bishop William H. Graves served as the vice chair of the NAACP for years. Bishop Henry M. Williamson Sr. served for a while as the president of a Rainbow Push Coalition. Elin Brown was a strong member of the SCLC board. So we've been in every phase of the movement. I happen to have served on the tri-ethnic committee that developed the desegregation plan for the desegregation of the Dallas Independent School District when I was pastoring there in the city. So we've been, and Marshall Gilmore was a strong leader when he pastored in Dayton, Ohio. So you could just go down the list of all the preachers and members who led and helped lead the civil rights movement all over the nation.
All right, this is from Earl McKinley. What are the challenges facing the Black church today? And what should the church be doing in the face of systemic racism in all areas of our society?
I won't say let's pray, but sometimes you feel that's about the only thing left to do. What if we look at the progress we've made through the years? Though we haven't gotten to the promised land yet, as Martin Luther King said, we've come a long way. Barack Obama served 8 years as president of the United States. Kamala Harris is the vice president of the United States. We have 55, I think, or so Black congresspersons. We have Black mayors all over the city, all over. Look at the tremendous impact that Black voters had in this last presidential election. So we're making a lot of progress. So I'd rather look at the glass half full, knowing that we have a lot of it still empty, but it's being filled up. But I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic, but we must keep our hands on the gospel plow and keep on working.
All right. From Geraldine Richardson, what is happening with the merger of the CME, AME, and AME Zion Church?
We kind of backed away from that a little bit because, as I mentioned a few moments ago, in our very open and honest discussions, our cultural traditions have evolved to the point that it's a little difficult for us to give up so much. So I'm not expecting for our merger talks to move toward organic union. But I think what's beginning to happen is we're beginning to look at ways that we can do things together and let one do one thing and another do another. I think we're looking closely at some of our non-US enterprises and letting one church work hard in one area and another church in another sort of like a comity arrangement, something like that we need to look at. But we don't talk too much now about organic union, but we do work together on a multitude of issues.
All right, and a question from Raymond Somerville. What roles did women play in the founding and early years of the CME Church?
Yes. As most churches of the time, their public role was very, very limited. The Black church, as most churches, was a predominantly male church, a patriarchal church, and women have had to fight ever since our inception for their rightful place. It was not until 1910 that we allowed a woman to even speak at one of our general conferences. It was not until 1960 something that we could officially ordaining women to be preachers. But I would only say about the CME Church that we have been sort of at the forefront of many of our other sisters and brother denominations. The role of women in society, as well as in the church, we have a long ways to go to give them equity and equality and their just due. And I think that's one of the, it's hard to confess historical sins, but I do think we need to acknowledge our historical sins. And one of our historical sin, our corporate sin, is how we have not allowed God's children, whom he created in his own image, female, equal rights and opportunity within the church.
All right, we have time for just a couple of more questions. This one is from Shannon Falk. As the African American household demographics become more diverse especially within the urbane communities? What impact will this have on the Black church and our teachings of Black theology and sustainability? The mixture of today's family is very different than a generation ago.
Well, I'm not sure, Shannon, I have an answer to that question, but it is becoming the paramount challenge to the Black community. Years ago, we had an argument where I served as chair of our Board of Christian Education. We wanted to put a picture of a mother and her two children on the cover of our Sunday school quarterly and say the Black family. And one of our strong preachers argued up and down, that's not a family. He contended a family is a father, a mother, and two children. We persuaded him that the family is a lot more inclusive than that. I think the same challenge is before us now with this multicultural. We're going to learn how to deal with people in terms of their needs, not how we define in terms of our previous models. So that's the paramount challenge before us. How can we preach the gospel to people where they are, how they are, without us trying to make them what we want them to be in order to preach the gospel and serve them.
All right, and this will be our last question for the evening. All over the country, we are seeing changing demographics and decaying structures that were once prosperous CME churches. What are your thoughts on church mergers and church planting?
Well, being a retired preacher, I can just sit on the sideline in my rocking chair and wonder what my brothers and sisters in leadership will do. But this challenge is not new. As I was the presiding bishop here in Georgia, there are many churches that once were thriving congregations, but the entire communities have left, and we've had to close many churches because of what they did. They're in Kentucky. Last year, 2 years ago now, Bishop Thomas had me come preach a closing service of a beautiful church where all the Black persons have moved away. The church is we couldn't sustain it because of lack of membership. That's the challenge. But people aren't dying. Churches may be empty, but the people are still around. So we need to find people where they are. And we may have to look at whether or not our structured churches are suitable for this day and age. The New Testament church did not begin with the cathedrals. It began, Paul would say, to the church in your house, or the churches they had to have in the catacombs. So I'm saying we have to redefine what we mean by church and go minister, preach the gospel to people where they are and as they are, and define church in those terms, not in terms of our theological predilections.
All righty, thank you, Bishop Lakey. I'm going to ask Claudette to join us again and close us out for the evening.
Yeah. Took me a minute there to get everything started. Bishop Lakey, we want to thank you so much. You have blessed us and given us so much information about the CME Church and the church period. So we just want you to know how much we appreciate you, and you kind of started out our lecture series, and we are just so thankful. For those of you that are interested, Our second lecture series will be about the AME Zion Church, and that will be on March the 22nd from 7 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. We hope that you will take the opportunity to just garner knowledge with us and learn more about our particular denominations. If you bow your heads with me, we'll end with a prayer and we'll say good night. Gracious God, we thank you for this opportunity to join together with like hearts and like minds as we discover more about our denominations and discover more about you. Now, please bless us individually and collectively as we go from this place at this time. Keep us, guide, and direct us. This we pray in the mighty name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Have a blessed evening, all of you.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.